Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sarah Finch, and I'm a PhD student at Emory University. Today, I'll be presenting our work on exploring the common evaluation procedures that are used for current chat-oriented dialogue systems. So there's a pretty widely accepted distinction in dialogue systems between those that are task-oriented and those that are open domain or chat-oriented. Traditionally, task-oriented dialogue systems carry out a conversation with a user in order to accomplish a specific goal. Because of this, there are some pretty obvious ways of measuring how successful a dialogue system is. You can pretty much just look at how accurately and efficiently the system is able to complete the task with the users. However, there's not such an obvious measurement for chat-oriented systems. Since the goal of a chat-oriented system is much less defined, and the aim is more to be an engaging and entertaining social companion, this is often difficult to reduce to specific observable outcomes. It becomes quickly apparent when reading current dialogue system works that there's actually a wide variety of evaluations being performed, which makes it difficult to compare different chat-oriented dialogue systems with one another, and even to identify what the best approach would be for evaluating a new one. Our goal in this work was to use the recent rapid growth in chat-oriented systems in order to identify which evaluation methods have been the most widely adopted by the community and to analyze the extent of variability within these methods. So in order to address our first goal of identifying the common evaluations, we selected 20 different papers that have been published within the last couple of years, making sure to select papers that have a lot of diversity in the actual chosen approaches. So from these 20 papers, we saw that both automated and human-driven evaluation protocols are frequently used, almost evenly across the board. And actually, many papers even use more than one of the evaluation types. So I first will briefly cover our observations on the use of automated metrics. The reason for this brevity is that looking into the automated metrics wasn't a main focus of our work, since there's already been kind of substantial effort into analyzing automated dialogue evaluation. But for our work, what we found is displayed here in this table. Essentially, this table shows which automated metrics have been used in the 20 papers and what papers specifically they were used in. So in total, we found 11 different automated metrics, where a handful of them are used somewhat widely across the papers, such as the blue score being used in 14 of them. In general, from looking at the different automated metrics, the automated metrics that are used tend to be explained as measuring either the ground truth response similarity, the context coherence of the system responses, and the overall response diversity. So although some analysis work has been done for automated dialogue system evaluation, the same is not as true for human evaluation methods. So we specifically focus on human evaluations in this current work. And I'll now move on to our observations there. For human evaluations, we saw two primary types being used, static and interactive, with static being much more common. A static evaluation generally involves generating a system response to a given dialogue context, and then having humans look at the dialogue context and the given response and rate the response on some specified dimensions. On the other hand, interactive evaluation has a human both actually interact with and have a conversation with the system, and then finally at the end of the interaction, rate the conversation on some specified dimensions. Within both types of human evaluations, the actual rating methodology had some variation too. Mostly, it was the case that numerical ratings were requested from the human, but a small number of works used preference selection instead, where the human selected which option from some set of options was better than the others instead of providing an actual explicit number. So one thing that all of these human evaluations shared in common was that the evaluation was done with respect to some specified characteristics of the conversations. When the evaluators were asked to provide a rating or even to pick the best option, it was phrased in the context of some dialogue dimension, like how relevant the response was or which response was the most human-like. So similar to what we did for the automated metrics, we also looked at the spread of dialogue dimensions across works. So this table shows the dialogue dimensions that were used and what paper they were used in. In total, we found 21 dialogue dimensions that were used. As you can see, there's pretty large sparsity present in this table where only few works use the same dialogue dimensions as others in their evaluations. And actually, there's really only one dimension that we saw, which is fluency, that was used on kind of a widespread basis. And even then, it was only used in 9 of the papers. So this kind of sparsity led us to look into the actual dialogue dimensions a little bit more. And on an intuitive basis, we noticed that a lot of the dialogue dimensions seem to be potentially synonyms or very similar to one another. And if this was actually true, that would mean that there's a lot more overlap in the human evaluations of these papers than it may at first seem. So in order to explore this idea more, we collected the definitions provided by each of the papers of their dialogue dimensions and tried to assess whether or not these definitions provided support for the merging of certain dialogue dimensions together. So to illustrate this process, let's take a look at an example. On this slide, you can see a table which provides the definitions that we could find for 4 dimensions across 7 papers, where the 4 dimensions are fluency, consistency, readability, and grammaticality. On the right-hand side, you can see the definition that each of the papers provided for those dimensions. And from looking at these definitions, you can see that each definition focuses on the same idea. They focus on the idea of the system's responses being fluent, understandable, and grammatical. And so due to this kind of high definitional overlap, we thought that there was sufficient evidence for treating these 4 dimensions as the same thing, namely as measuring the grammaticality of a system response. We followed a similar procedure for the rest of the 21 dialogue dimensions that we observed in the papers, and we ended up finding 5 different dimension groupings that spanned 17 of those dialogue dimensions, which can be seen here. So these 5 groupings basically resulted in dimensions of grammaticality, relevance, informativeness, emotional understanding, and overall quality as main dimensions that previous works have used. However, we also saw that there were 4 dialogue dimensions that did not share any definition overlap with any other dimensions from the papers. One of these kind of unique dialogue dimensions was actually very approach specific, so we discarded it for the purposes of this work. But the remaining 3 unique dialogue dimensions were engagingness, consistency, and proactivity. So based on our analysis, we ended up with 8 dialogue dimensions that can reasonably be applied to any dialogue system regardless of approach type. The 8 dimensions that we ended up with can be seen here, and the top half of this table shows those that were derived by grouping across papers, which are grammaticality, relevance, informativeness, emotional understanding, and quality. And then the bottom half shows those that ended up being kind of unique across papers, which were engagingness, consistency, and proactivity. So given this derived set of dialogue dimensions, we wanted to assess the relationship of the dimensions to one another. Specifically, we were interested in how each dimension related to the overall quality perception of the user. So we used 100 rated conversations from the Alexa Prize, which is a competition held by Amazon, where university teams compete to build kind of the most engaging social bot for human users. And from the Alexa Prize setup, we were able to collect a data set of real conversations that were actually interactively rated by the users at the end, giving a score from 1 to 5 on the user's overall impression of the conversation that they just had. So this type of a rating fits the description of the overall quality dialogue dimension. However, the other 7 dimensions that we previously discussed are absent from this data set. So to remedy this, we also did an expert analysis on the same conversations, where we manually rated the conversations on each of the dialogue dimensions previously discussed, including giving an overall quality rating. So the main goal of this case study was to provide a preliminary understanding of the importance of different dialogue dimensions to overall human perception of dialogue quality. However, I do want to point out that due to the low agreement between the expert overall quality rating and the user's overall quality rating, it is difficult to draw any conclusive results from our case study, but we do hope that this work further encourages additional exploration in this area. So in terms of results, what we found is that relevance and proactivity, which are shown on as the 2 graphs on the left-hand side of this slide, actually display kind of the strongest positive relationship with the overall quality rating. And this suggests that a dialogue system that's able to produce relevant responses that drive the conversation forward in an active way is quite desirable for the overall kind of satisfaction with the dialogue. We also found that informativeness and engagingness have a positive relationship with overall quality, although it's not quite as strong, and those two graphs are shown here on the right-hand side of the screen. So this suggests that the amount of interesting and non-repetitive content in the system's responses is also important, although potentially not as strongly correlated as the relevance and proactivity. The relationship between the emotional understanding and consistency to overall quality was unclear from our results, which was somewhat expected since the dialogue system that we used in this case study had little variation on these dimensions. Perhaps the most interesting result that we observed was the negative relationship between grammaticality and overall quality, although it was a very slight negative relationship. One possible explanation for this is that the overall kind of grammatical responses of the overall grammaticality of the responses of our dialogue system was very high in general. Most of the responses were indeed grammatical, and there were only kind of infrequent small mistakes in grammaticality. And so this type of distribution does not really reduce the overall good experience within the conversation, even when the small mistakes are encountered. So that brings us to the end of this talk, where we have presented an analysis of current evaluation protocols for chat-oriented dialogue systems. So to highlight the main points, we found that there are three primary types: automated, static human, and interactive human. And we observed that across recent human evaluations, there seem to be 8 dialogue dimensions that are commonly used and commonly applicable. Of these 8, we found that relevance, proactivity, informativeness, and engagingness seem to have the strongest positive correlation with overall quality of dialogues, although this is only a preliminary observation and something we plan to explore more in future large-scale user studies. So with that, we're at the conclusion of this talk, and I would like to thank you for listening.